Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Regroup Podcast, the podcast where I have the opportunity to interview good people doing great work. Today, our guest is Louis Diez. Louis is the host and founder of the Donor Participation Project. Louis has a long, impressive career in fundraising, working with annual giving organizations, as well as consulting for quite a few different nonprofits. Louis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, David. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And I have to say, it totally goes both ways. I learn a ton from you every time we chat.
Likewise. I'm curious, Louis, how did you get into working in the nonprofit space? What was your start?
So I joke that I started out as a violinist and then I downgraded into being a violist. So anybody who's in music, there are lots of viola jokes out there. And that wasn't enough for me. So I went further down and I turned into a fundraiser. And so, I was into music, and that's what I thought was going to be my career. And I ended up playing with a symphony in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Wow.
And everything. Had studied in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in my home country in Spain. But then as I got closer to graduating, I kind of wanted to hedge my bets, and I'd studied business too. So fundraising kind of seemed like the place where it all came together. So like if you're technical, there's a ton of technical stuff to help with, and improve fundraising, with and improve, and help missions that way. But if you're a kind of a more outgoing people person, then there's a whole career there, right? You can be a gift officer, you can be a major gift officer, you can, all the way to leading a whole shop, and everything in between. If you're into writing, if you're into design. So it really did feel like fundraising was a place where it all came together for me. And I had a background in economics a little bit, and it's also kind of, really running experiments with people, which is behavioral sciences, which I liked a whole lot. So it was kind of a natural evolution, but it was just by chance, David, totally. I started out as an intern in New York with an orchestra there. I saw that their CEO was a really good fundraiser, so I thought, hey, maybe there's something there. And I went back to school. I found a job in our advancement office at the school, and it just started, went on from there.
In school, you said you had a background in economics. Was that your major, or what did you major in?
Really complicated. So I did kind of like the whole schooling sequence in Spain. So bachelor's, master's, PhD, and that economics things I was talking about. In Europe, the music track is parallel, so you don't necessarily do it at university. So I did that in the conservatory, and I did another whole track of that, and that's kind of what led me to come to the States with my wife to do a teaching assistantship, where we were teaching and receiving lessons at the University of Tennessee to be musicians. So I think the answer is all of the above.
Well, it's very impressive. Your whole education system, and what's even more impressive, I guess, is sort of post-education, all the work that you've done. Is there any specific job that you've had over the years that stands out to you as being particularly impactful on your growth or your mentality as a fundraiser?
So when we were studying in Belgium in the conservatory there, I had a side gig as a mariachi musician. We were joking about that before you started recording. And that was quite the experience. I was the guy who played the bass guitar. It's called the guitarrón. And people would say, like, he's definitely not Mexican. So, I tried. Any one job, I would say it's kind of the opposite. It's the fact that fundraising kind of allowed me to bring everything together, kind of bring that, that people talk a lot about bringing your whole self to work, but it really did integrate a lot of what I'd done in the past. So I like music and kind of more mission, cultural oriented, activity and work. So obviously, you're fundraising for causes. I had a business background, so that was, impactful. I had a little bit of the sciencey background, so there too. I like computers, and you and I geek out about programming and stuff. So that's kind of how I found my path in fundraising, because a lot of the fundraising, especially that I saw in the States, was very much kind of major gifts, relational, one-on-one conversations type of fundraising, and that I was always thinking, well, how can we do that but with more people?
Right.
Give something like that experience to more people. So yeah, that's kind of how I guess it all came together. But I mean, honestly, very rocky, lots of doubts and hesitations, lots of thinking this is totally not my career.
Yeah.
I think just like everybody.
There's ups and downs for everyone, but you've seemed to have made quite a name for yourself, at least starting up the donor participation project. Now I'm interested, what is the donor participation project, and what's the issue with donor participation?
So this is kind of a loaded question, because I know you know the answer. You've been a very helpful partner in all of this. And I know the cause kind of speaks to you, at least at some level. But the donor participation project is essentially a monthly meetup that we started back in the summer of 2020 with a group of nonprofit fundraisers. That has grown. We've expanded to just kind of people who are also serve nonprofits and help nonprofits serve their missions better. But we started getting together to talk about topics related to donor participation. So why don't more people give to nonprofits? The number has been going down in the States, at least, and I think to some extent worldwide, in the last 2-3 decades. So it's like a mega trend.
Yeah.
And really, we didn't think that there was a lot of like super original practical thinking around it. A lot of it was like, well, fundraisers need to treat their donors better. You better call all your donors every day before breakfast. And
right.
The reality is, can't do. Sorry, it's not going to happen. So we need to think about this from lots of different angles and kind of support each other too. So that's how it started.
So I'm curious, have you sort of nailed down a leading cause of the decline in donor participation? Do you have a theory on what's causing this?
I have a theory, and when people say, do you have proof? Well, I don't think that we are going to have like definitive proof, but I do think that there's lots of good research and it all points in the same direction. So I think, this is kind of like a preponderance of evidence. Like that would be like, I know what my best bet is for an explanation, which is the amount of information that everybody in society, but obviously donors too, the amount of information that they have available has exploded. There was that saying from the CEO of Google that said in the last 2 years, humanity has generated as much data as the previous 300 years, or since the beginning of history.
Yeah.
Right. So what that has meant, that has changed society a little bit. It has meant that people can have a lot more freedom in the sources of information they consume. It is no longer media, nonprofits, government, kind of the what you might call like the establishment that controls information that's available. I mean, look at us right now, right? You're doing a podcast, and you could reach the world, So people have started to trust the organizations that provided this information, nonprofits, governments, media, less. And I think fundraising, when people say it's a relationship-based business, well, I mean, relationship is how you build trust. So, I mean, it's like for me, it's really a trust-based business. You don't make a significant investment in a nonprofit, or even any investment unless you trust them. Right. So this whole atmosphere has caused a decline in trust. You see that in other things. There are fewer people participating in religious organizations, right? So it's kind of the same thing. It used to be that, the church was a source of knowledge respected, and that's not necessarily the case anymore. There's a decline in volunteerism, so there are fewer and fewer people volunteering. This doesn't mean that people are not generous, but they might be giving directly to each other on Facebook. They might be supporting an artist or a creator that they like directly, again, through a social media platform or on Patreon. So it's nonprofits have not been able to evolve, keep up, and that's a little bit of what we're trying to do with the project. Is okay, so what needs to change, given that the world has changed on us.
That's hard to deal with, because the problem is sort of goes beyond an easy fix that a nonprofit can implement, and it seems to be like nonprofits just haven't kept pace with they couldn't even keep pace with just the total amount of content in the world expanding and all vying for the same attention, right? What do you think is like a good solution to that, if there is any, like that a typical nonprofit could use?
That's a really good answer. And people see it in marketing too, right? So ads are less effective than they used to be 10 years ago. It's the same phenomenon, right? And I think a lot of the solutions are in the same line of what you talk about. So communicate in ways that are authentic, that are relatable, that start two-way conversations, not just, hey, we're great, like sometimes nonprofits communicate in a way that almost everything looks like an ad. So, and essentially communicate in ways that build community. And that's my number one bet, building communities. And I kind of call them communities of purpose, to distinguish them a little bit from audiences, which is, some people say they have a community and it's, they really have an audience. They just have a bunch of people on Twitter and they broadcast to them. And then of purpose, because communities form naturally, it's part of the human beings, but it's when communities have a purpose that kind of the magic happens. And nonprofits need communities to have a purpose, which is aligned with their mission. So communities are a great way to build trust. There's really good research about that. There's a phenomenon called vulnerability loops.
What is that?
Okay, so it's like the micro moments when you're doing something with somebody, like cooking, right? And you have to show vulnerability, like, oh my goodness, I cut myself. And then somebody steps up and helps you. And that creates a loop that builds trust, and that makes you more comfortable being vulnerable. So when you create those moments, people start trusting each other much more. And trust is not just about helping you with a cut, but once you trust each other, then that leads to lots of really good things.
Interesting. So showing failure and like hardship, I guess commuting that to a community would actually be a strength rather than a weakness in growing community or trust. I'd say that's like pretty opposite to the current advice, where it's, I don't know, very professional communication, top down, like everything. Like when I think of a nonprofit, I think of everything every penny we're giving to you is being perfectly allocated towards our mission, and we're doing totally fine, and everything is good. And maybe that's like such a sanitary message is not really strong. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, people are so skeptical about that now, and they can smell it a mile away. Right? Especially once, they start talking about you separately, which they are going to in social media with their friends on WhatsApp, and they're going to start pointing out, things that don't match that message. But it's also not, about broadcasting huge needs and these gory stories of sadness. It's much more about doing things together, so kind of like building in public,
right?
And just sharing that there are struggles along the way, and that you need people's help, and asking for people's input, and not just for money, and kind of having an acknowledgement that there are lots of levels of engagement for people. And I think the essence is about communicating in ways that are more human, relatable, authentic, and that inspire action.
Now, what it seems like nonprofits have been maybe a little bit behind the curve in terms of building these communities and adapting the way they communicate. Is there a reason you think that, is there a reason you think that nonprofits are so behind? Is it just a, maybe being hesitant to switch things up or innovate? Like, what's the issue there? Is it the culture?
Well, several ideas and things that I believe are going on. One of them is that nonprofits are typically led by boards, and then they hire a CEO or an executive director. Boards are typically kind of among the more well-educated, more high net worth segment of society.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something going on also in this whole trust thing called trust inequality. Okay. Where remember we were saying that people trust in institutions less and less, and nonprofits, government, media, all of that. But people who are well educated and who are in the kind of that elite level don't see things that way. And this is mostly data coming from something called the Edelman Trust Barometer.
Okay.
And they published like a 20-year review of their annual survey on trust. And they mentioned this. If anybody wants to Google that, it shows it, pretty clearly. So that's number one, right? So there are people that leading the nonprofit who don't see the issue. So that's
interesting.
That kind of makes it hard for the rank and file and people who are most directly in contact with a larger number of constituents to push that message up. A part of it is technology. So a lot of this is we're thinking about extending that major donor experience to as many people as possible. So, before you sent a letter, that's not very interactive. Now you could send surveys, right? So this is something I try to get more nonprofits to do. Instead of just broadcasting information, try to start a dialogue. And an interview with a mass of people is called a survey.
Yeah.
You can't do them one-on-one. So, and a lot of these same techniques because they just pop up in digital marketing, in engagement work. They just pop up everywhere because they work, right?
Yeah.
So technology, between technology, a little bit of just resistance to change, and this issue with the trust inequality and the different perceptions of what's going on, I think all of that just creates this environment for making it hard to change.
Now, could there be possibly some maybe like misincentives where the way that you communicate with possibly like large donors is the way that you build sort of a wide base? Now I've sort of two questions here. One, is the average nonprofit really going hard after those big major gift to donors? And are those the people that they're tailoring their communications to primarily and like building their brand around? Or is it sort of the wide base trying to cast a wide net, attract everybody in, and then maybe like micro communicate to the major gift donors? Do you sort of get what I'm going after there? Yeah.
Yes, totally. And it's a really insightful question. I would say that my experience is not representative of whatever the average nonprofit is, because there are lots of different models for a nonprofit. So some nonprofits have like a general interest mission, and potentially the total addressable market for that nonprofit is the entire world, so billions of people.
Right.
Other nonprofits are like a school, and they have the alumni that they have that grows every year. But somebody on the street is not as likely to have affinity for a specific school or a specific hospital, right? Unless they obtain treatment there. So there are lots of approaches. I would say, like, if we had to generalize, is that at least in the United States, there has been a very good, very effective, very practical model for major gift fundraising that continues to work in this high trust world of the prospects that exist, for major gifts. When we go beyond that, Well, there's kind of two things happening. One is that we haven't updated our practices in regards to like digital marketing, communications, technology. But the other is that that group of people trusts us less and less. So not only do we have to update, we really have to think about doing things differently. So if a nonprofit thinks that somebody is going to be a what you might call like an annual fund donor or a mass giving donor,
Mhm.
typically suddenly you don't get asked for your opinion anymore, or you don't get included in things. You just get these letters with with a story and somebody asking you for money, and that's the divide we're trying to bridge.
I want to clarify if if a if a nonprofit's model is annual gifts, then they just send out like less personalized communication. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, it's really hard to generalize. So if you're thinking
Yeah.
of like UNICEF, right, that does a tremendous amount of this mass, direct response fundraising, they have lots of sophistication.
Mhm.
The average kind of smaller nonprofit, typically
I see.
that I've experienced, typically has a small team working on major gifts,
Mhm.
and then another team working on this annual fund direct response approach, right?
Right.
And that's where the disconnect happens,
Interesting.
in my experience.
Now, with donor participation, does is the reduction in donor participation happening both at the major gift level and at the annual giving level, or is one being hit harder than the other?
So the total amounts raised keep growing.
Okay.
Although they have stayed at a pretty stable level, at least in the US, around, I don't know, 2 point something or 3% of GDP. So
Okay.
that hasn't budged. I don't know if it should change,
Mhm.
but the reality is it hasn't. What is going down is the number of households who give to a nonprofit every year.
Interesting.
And that's gone down like by tens of millions. So households that used to give every year to a nonprofit no longer
Mhm.
give to a nonprofit. Um,
Mm.
and that kind of makes you think, well, this trend doesn't seem sustainable, right? Because if we have fewer and fewer people and they're giving more and more, at some point those people are going to, fall off for a variety of reasons. They're going to stop giving, they're going to grow too old, and there's not going to be a pipeline to regenerate that.
And it seems like it's going to be harder for maybe even like the average nonprofit startup to get going if they can't cast like a base of, I don't know, community members at like a smaller level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
although like startups also have the benefit that they don't have all this baggage,
Mhm.
and they can actually start building a community. Like they can start with the big, where you
Right,
should
right.
really always start with just engaging people and building a community, and then doing things together, aka fundraising.
Um, Now I wanted to ask about your experience with universities. Um, is it so I had sort of a theory here, and let me know if I'm way off, okay?
Mhm.
You've had like a quite a bit of experience with quite a bit of background in annual giving at the university
Mhm.
level, right? So
Mhm.
the way that I see it is the annual giving fund is somewhat reflective of the quality of the student's experience, right? So the higher level of donor participation is going to be reflected in, or is going to be uh, a reflection of how well the school did in educating them, right? At some level,
I
it's going to
mean,
measure
at
that.
some level, for sure. At some level, the amount of debt that alumni have now has exploded versus what they
Mm,
used to have. At some level, the value of just being an alum has kind of it's hard to generalize, no, but in lots of
yeah,
places has degraded over time because investment has, you know it's like this shrinking market mentality, and then shops are saying, oh my goodness, there's a smaller pie, we need to invest in getting those larger gifts, and they've kind of forgot about engaging, building community, providing value to alums more generally.
So that's the question. When you're an annual gift donor, it seems like it's hard on the back end to sort of retroactively change the student's mind on how much value they actually got out of the whole experience. There's not too many levers you can pull. So Louis, does the annual giving team have a seat at the table when they're designing the student experience or any sort of curriculum, seeing as how annual giving fund or like donor participation amongst alumni is going to be a direct measure or a KPI of how much value they actually received from their education?
Yeah, so it is a really complicated topic, and everybody kind of has their opinion. So, do people give because they had a great student experience? Probably yes, to some measure. Do people, if you ask people why they give, some of them will say that. Some of them will say it's because I'm grateful. Some of them will say it's because what we all do in our family, we all give to our schools. Some of them will say it's because what my fellow football team players from 30 years ago, we all do together for this school. So it's, when thinking of like what a nonprofit or what just a rank and file fundraiser should do, that's kind of a hard thing to tackle. And it reminds me of like, that saying about Amazon, that they try to improve the things that they can control. So you really can't control that to some extent. And even if in an ideal school, and I'm sure, really good schools do this, as you suggest, but you can't change what happened 20 years ago, right? So then, have you lost that person forever? And what I've found, kind of putting on the behavioral science hat, is that the largest gift amount that somebody gives is correlated to how many years they give consecutively, to show how loyal they are, how long they've stuck around, giving to a nonprofit. And I do this as an analysis for nonprofits that want to, start designing a plan to get more sustainable revenue. And every time I pull the data, it happens, wham again. Like I have a fellow consultant I work with, and I say, then the consecutive years versus lifetime giving strikes again, because you always see the same pattern. So that's one thing. That's really one thing that's actionable right now, where fundraisers can improve the situation. You can do things that keep people around for longer, and that build on that experience.
That's super interesting. That reminds me of you mentioned it's like behavioral psychology. That reminds me of like the micro ask principle. If you ask for something like super small, people are more likely to give it to you. And then even if you increase the amount, then they're still likely to just continue working with you, or they're going to give it. Is that sort of a strategy like these fundraisers use, where they'll ask for like $1 or some insignificant ask?
I mean, I don't think that they like purposefully think about it this way, right? And it sounds kind of like, they're manipulating people. But if you think of kind of where potential donors and where nonprofit constituents are in their relationship with a nonprofit, it is true that you want to start the relationship, where they are. So if the next ask is share your email with us, or fill in this form, don't start with, will you make a gift? Right. And being able to intelligently determine who is at what stage, and then take people through that path is really hard, as to that scale, right? Because you don't know so much about people generally, right? And it's also kind of the way to go. So you want to keep people engaged over several years, and kind of applying that principle that you mentioned of asking, for one thing at a time. The good thing is that being a loyal donor or being a loyal community member that's engaged with a nonprofit is mostly available to everybody, right? So it's more democratic to me, it kind of seems, than making a $100,000 gift.
Everybody always talks about customer retention. I think the number is it's 4 times more expensive to get a new customer than it is to keep a returning or like keep a existing customer. I
Yeah.
assume that applies just as well in the donor world.
Totally. And it's even better. I was going to say worse, but it's even better because there's no upper limit to what somebody can give.
Right.
So it's like it keeps compounding. The longer somebody retains, if they have the capacity to do so, the more likely they are to make those outsized gifts. And honestly, that's where most of the money just by dollar amount comes, right? So you can raise $101 gifts or have one person give you 1,000 and tenfold what you raised, right?
Right. That's interesting. Actually, okay, that makes me think of sort of a question. This is going to be a little bit out there.
Yep.
In marketing, generally, if you're going to try and increase your lifetime value of a customer, you want some super high-end package, right? At the highest level. Maybe if you're normally selling a $50 item, you might want a $5,000, $10,000 item. So if, the one person that buys it, it's going to cover
Yep.
a
Makes
lot of
up for all the
expenses.
engagement, all the freebies you're giving,
Yeah.
all the other investments.
Now, the way that's usually packaged in a way so that there's some exponential amount of value that person is going to get. With nonprofits, do you have a way to sort of package these gifts? Do you have sort of like gold tier, platinum tier, super diamond tier fundraiser things, or is that like a common pricing system, I guess, or like donor fundraising system for most nonprofits, or is that something a little bit more niche?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally. I think the most popular parallels are at the platinum tier, you get to put the name on the building, right? Or on the on the hospital research lab. And lots of nonprofits have giving societies, which is a way to try to create that same approach. Recognition is a very powerful way to provide value. People like to be recognized and in front of their peers as somebody who does that. We see that. I mean, look at YouTube creators, right? They put up the name of their last Patreon subscriber, things like that. But it's because people see that and you're providing value to the one who gave and you're inspiring others, right? So I think it's some of the same concepts are very much parallel, but I do think it's like in marketing sometimes in general, right? Since you're providing something, a good, a service, I don't think that you need as much trust. Like the trust building piece is, I find to be super important in nonprofits. So if you're getting something and it has more of an objective value, a gold pen, maybe that balances out a little bit.
See, I think it's different. I think in marketing, you still need a lot of trust, but the trust needs to be placed in a different way. So if you're selling a product or service, you need to believe that that product or service will achieve the outcome for you that you most desire, right? What are the likelihoods that if I buy a gym membership that I'm actually going to get ripped and, everything will work for me. Now, with a nonprofit, I think trust works a slightly different way, right? Because you don't have to trust that they're going to deliver something for you. You have to trust that they're going to deliver something for somebody else. And you don't necessarily get to see that firsthand, or at least in some organizations. I get with like a university, you kind of get to build that trust, like you experientially get to build that trust, but there's more different aspects of trust that you have to overcome.
Yeah, exactly. I think it goes both ways. You have to have trust in that the mission is going to be delivered and your gift is going to have the impact that you want it to have. You also need to have the trust that you're going to be recognized and you're going to receive the emotional value. So I gave a place $100. There's a saying. In fact, it happens so much. There's like a joke about it. The best way to never hear again from a nonprofit is to give them $1,000, right? And that's betraying that trust.
Oh no.
So yeah, you're right.
Is that a problem, like with follow-up and it is? Yeah.
Yeah, huge. Like there's people, and if you're in the kind of if anybody in your audience follows kind of people who talk about this on LinkedIn, people will do this study time and time again. I made a small gift to 50 nonprofits, and I got 10 automated thank you emails and 2 emails that looked like they were from a real person, and I didn't hear
Really?
anything from anybody else. It's
Wow.
typically really bad.
They don't even have automation set up. That's too bad. Yeah. I guess at like the major gifts levels, I don't know. It seems like you'd be able to outsource something at least, right? To get like some sales rep to
Well, I
give a
think, no,
personalized
I mean,
email.
major gift levels, let's just,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm generally assuming that this happens very well and there's enough ROI there to justify the time. I think it's once you go into that, we have a large number of gifts coming in
Mhm.
this way where things start to break down.
Well, it's probably that middle space, right? Between like, small gifts versus like at the major gifts, people are going to notice and they're going to want to reach out to you. But maybe at the
Exactly.
couple $100, couple $1,000, depending on the size of the nonprofit, people won't be wasting their time. I don't want to say waste their time. People won't be taking their time to follow up,
To
give a
follow
personalized
up
thank you.
exactly
Yeah.
there. Or imagine if you have been giving to a nonprofit and you increased your gift, or maybe if you increased your gift twice in a row, wouldn't you think that that was worthy of being noticed? Typically, all of that falls through the cracks. And, this is where automation, again,
Yeah.
and tools that have appeared in the last 5 years, probably, just make it so much easier to provide better experiences.
Now, let's see. I have a question. It's going to be very loaded and almost impossible to answer.
Okay.
If you were a new if you're a brand new nonprofit, okay, what are like the systems for fundraising? What are like the first steps that you take to building a quality fundraising program? Do you start building trust? Do you start direct like response, reaching out to people? What would your advice be?
I mean, we both happen to be involved with a startup mission-oriented organization, which is the Donor Participation Project. And I'm trying to model what I think should be done. So one is start with the community. And I actually have a definition in my brain of what a healthy, well-functioning community is. And that is a group of people who get together in ways that are participatory, purposeful, recurring, and that identify leaders. So we're trying to do all of that. And then, so I would say that's kind of the basics. So like, I wouldn't start thinking about systems and crowdfund. Lots of people go to start immediately thinking about crowdfunding campaigns and what photo they need to put on the site and things like that. I wouldn't honestly worry at all about that. And then once you do that, and probably organically, there will be projects that come, some of which require support. That's happened to us too. The next thing I think about is how do you establish systems to thank people appropriately and keep them engaged with you. So for instance, the back end of the Donor Participation Project is a bunch of Zapier, Airtable.
Yeah.
And this is like a nonprofit startup at the very, very ground zero level, right? But still enough that a person and a group of volunteers can manage. So that's, I honestly, lots of times people kind of ask me for help on their solicitations for their annual fund. And, I start to ask questions and we end up working on their gift acknowledgement and gift renewal processes first. Honestly, that's where the highest impact is at the beginning. Did this answer the question?
It answers it perfectly. Really starting with brand, starting with building community, and then everything else will follow from there, right? I agree. Like, it's good to build systems and stuff, but
yeah,
you can't build systems if nobody's coming in the pipeline.
There you go.
Yeah.
Or I mean, the same with digital marketing, right? You need to have a product that people want. That you can't market something into existence that isn't there.
And how do you know what the people want if you don't speak to them?
Yeah, exactly.
One-on-one. Yeah.
Yeah. Totally there.
Now, we met through a mutual connection. And the sort of the project that we're both working on is Level Up Gaming. Do you want to explain what that is a little bit? Because I'm very excited about this.
Okay, and David, you know so much more about this than I do, because I was a total outsider to gaming communities, to esports, to streaming communities, but I learned a little bit about them when we did the Donor Participation Project did a conference back in April, and there was one presenter who presented for 5 minutes on that, and I thought, well, this sounds like there are real communities here. So,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't sound like this kind of new, crypto.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like a gimmick or a trick. It sounds like there's real people getting together regularly with a purpose, blah, 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 blah. So we started to explore that, and we kind of formed a volunteer think tank, essentially. And, I'm so lucky that we got to meet through this project. And we started to put together a course thinking that, well, there is something here. We don't, probably it's a component of a healthy fundraising program, but it's growing.
Mm-hmm.
People are philanthropic and it's community driven. So let's try to bring it to nonprofit fundraisers to learn about it. And we put on a course.
Now, so you originally heard the I guess about the gaming communities through that presentation. Was that with April?
No, that was Marcus Howard.
Was it? Okay.
Yes, because he was talking about how the demographics of gaming communities are much more diverse than your typical nonprofit donor groups, right? So that was essentially, what he spoke about, and he had a lightning round presentation for like 5 minutes at the conference. So that's how it started. We started a back and forth, and then I asked the Donor Participation Project, is anybody here into gaming? And suddenly we had like 7-8 people. So that's what happens with gaming and all of this. You don't know how many people are involved. It's really counterintuitive. Like a colleague at work might be running a gaming server that's among the biggest in the world. And this actually happened in our committee. Mm-hmm. We have somebody that's running one of the top servers for a specific game in the United States. So it was amazing, mind-blowing.
It seems like your thesis around gaming is really just ties into community. Like everything about you, Louis, is tying back to community, genuine relationships. And do you see marketing as just a strong medium to build relationships, or what's sort of your view on that? Do you think there's anything different about gaming, any specific challenges from the standpoint of a fundraiser?
For sure. So I think we talked about communities, and I mentioned that I thought that the ideal communities are purposeful. Mm-hmm. So sometimes gaming communities are purposeful and sometimes they're not, just like any community in the world, right? But I think the potential is when they adopt a purpose, hopefully a social good purpose, and they're helping people, right? And not anything else. So that's one. Number two is that the most prevalent way that nonprofits are fundraising with gaming right now is kind of like third-party events. So their volunteers are streamers that have a community themselves, but it's not the nonprofit's community. It's a group of people that get together to watch that streamer. And then that streamer is kind of a volunteer for the nonprofit and will do a fundraiser for them. And you organize maybe a giving day, an event, and you have lots of streamers doing this and you grow this model. But that's kind of the model. It's not clear to me that those people who give through the streamer to the nonprofit will really end up in a relationship with the nonprofit, which, as we we saw, we were talking about, the kind of the jackpot is in the long game, right? When you were able to keep people around. So I would say those two are a little bit of a challenge.
I see. It maybe like through recurring events, like recurring gaming events, that seems the way to maybe keep your nonprofit at the top of mind in a specific community. And then maybe, I mean, I'm just throwing things out here, maybe finding ways to integrate your nonprofit's activity into like the day-to-day in some meaningful way of that community. Totally. And so it's not just that
because we talked, it's recurring, and that piece. So a story that happened when I was running the Donor Participation Project while I had my full-time job was 1 month I forgot to send a calendar invite for a session. Mm-hmm. And they're usually on Wednesdays, sometime, in the middle of the month, and people started calling me saying, hey, I had this like in my calendar, aren't we doing this? And it was all because we had that recurring
Yeah,
habit, and that's what creates the community. I think that's kind of like where nonprofits might think about going with this whole gaming thing.
interesting.
I think you're totally right.
I think that's, I mean, just from my experience, that seems totally spot on with how, I guess, the meta, for lack of a better word, will develop. Speaking
Yeah.
of meta, in our conversation on your podcast, you asked me a little bit about sort of the metaverse, what I thought about that in regards to marketing. Do you have, are you hopeful for or for the future of the metaverse, or are you skeptical? What are your thoughts there?
Well, so in general, I don't know why, but yes, because I kind of like grew up as a fundraiser who like the model of fundraising in my head was very much about relations.
Mm-hmm.
So I tend to like be skeptical about technologies, but I have also read articles that made the argument for the fact that some people are practically almost living in the metaverse right now. So if you think of the metaverse as a digitally enabled life, and you think of the amount of hours that we spend on a screen, we're speaking right now. We've never met in person. Can you believe that? Right?
Yeah.
And I feel like like there's chemistry and everything. So some people are to some extent already in the metaverse, and it has really positive effects, and I think like all the turmoil that's happening in the world, and then I kind of reflect on, well, why don't I have more friends that are in China and Ukraine, in Ukraine and Russia? I mean, there's really no reason why it shouldn't happen, right? So
Right.
I'm kind of optimistic for where it can go. That's kind of my take on it. But as long as we're, creating relationships, but we're kind of proving the point that it works.
Yeah.
On Zoom and on all these groups.
So just, taking the same principles of relationship building and just adapting it to new mediums, really. And
yeah, I mean, exactly. And digital mediums.
Yeah.
And, I think that, in fact, for me, really, the big question is, are all these communities that are already forming in whatever this is, the pre-metaverse, will they be able to like get stuff done? I mean, I think that's, my biggest question. And maybe will we have just like these mega communities in the future that are, I don't know, trans world. I don't know. I'm kind of joking, but I think there's something there. Games are a metaverse. Like I read an article that said the metaverse is already here. It's called Fortnite.
Yeah.
That's kind of true.
I think it is. I think the new technology will just be able to enable a lot of cool new stuff. And just, I guess, change maybe the way a little bit that we interact with donors. I think there will be a lot of cool marketing things you can do with it, but it'll enable a lot of good communication and ways to express yourself, which I think is important, right? When building relationships.
Totally. I mean, yeah, what I don't know, what I have doubts about is like what it will actually look like. It's kind of the same with crypto technologies and blockchain, etc. I think it will enable lots of amazing stuff, lots of efficiencies. You'll be able to turn lots of things into financial assets that you couldn't do before, like even a blog post.
Yeah.
It's just what it's specifically going to look like. I don't think it's what we're seeing right now. It's probably not going to be like monkey photos, but it's going to be something pretty amazing down the line.
I think so. Now there's a question I missed, but if there's a decline in donor participation across the board, are there any categories of nonprofits that are being disproportionately hit hard, or maybe ones that are doing very well in this new environment?
So I hope this answers the question, and if it doesn't, David, please reorient me. But
sure.
In the research I've done, I discovered only one nonprofit subsector that was growing in number of donors. where we have benchmarking and there is data, and that is public media in the US. So why is that? Again, could be that there's just people are just more generous, but they also pivoted very strongly towards a monthly giving kind of subscription like a giving model. And I think that is the natural giving counterpart to communities. So, when I talk about kind of what the solutions are, and you asked me about this at the beginning, it's 1, building communities, 2, feeding communities with content, and 3, asking for the right things, which very often will be something like a monthly gift.
Are these public media organizations? Is this like NPR, stuff like that?
Yeah. And all the member stations. And they had a very strong reorientation of their kind of like mass fundraising, those drives that they do on the radio, to ask for monthly gifts as the primary way of supporting them.
Interesting. Ooh, here's my question off of that. When you see, and I don't know if you'd be able to measure this, but I wonder if there's research. When you see a community member, and they have to be a community member, when you see a community member donate for the first time, is there a noticeable uplift in general community engagement to, and this is just speculation, to maybe psychologically justify the donation? Does that make sense?
So you're asking what goes first? No, I mean, like, correlation doesn't mean causation, right?
Exactly.
Is it that people are more engaged because they gave, or does being more engaged lead them to give? I do highlight this in the data all the time. The same thing when I look at the number of touch points that a donor has and how much they've given. Very directly correlated. So somebody who gives, smaller amounts usually has few touch points, 1, 2, 3. Somebody who gives $100,000 or more has 28 touch points on average in one study, right? So, but does that mean that that one causes the other? We don't have the answer for sure, but I think, like, if you think of this as a human, they probably kind of both rise at the same time according to the level of engagement. So, like, the donor does a little bit, and the nonprofit does a little bit, and the donor does a little bit, and suddenly they're making this large gift. But that's true. Yeah, it's a really good point. The data, I haven't seen studies that prove one thing or the other.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. I'm excited for sort of this new era of tech-enabled community building with nonprofits. That's especially mission-driven, right? Because that's the advantage that nonprofits have over maybe traditional business and random content creators. Yeah,
exactly.
And it should be easier in general to build community around that and engage with the community through, platforms like Zoom or LinkedIn or whatever other 1,000 SaaS companies that have popped up.
Totally.
So I'm excited for the future, and I think we haven't even scratched the surface of what we can do with community building. And Louis, I think you are a fantastic example of somebody that is doing everything right and starting up with your own community of fundraising professionals and people in the nonprofit space in general. So
thanks,
thank you,
David. It's to some extent it's a big bet, and we're we think this is the way, and we're trying to live it, and it may work, it may not work, but it's going to be fun. That's for sure. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Louis, thank you very, very much for coming on. Your insights are tremendously valuable, at least to me, and I hope to the Regroup Media Podcast's audience.
Awesome. Okay, so everybody who's listening, please get in touch with David, because he's not going to say it, because he wants to build a community with you, and that requires two-way participation.
It does.
So if I can say anything, to close off the show, is that reach out to David in any way possible format you can, and we'll be in touch.
And reach out to Louis. Louis, where can the people reach you? Or is there any events maybe that they should check out if they want to learn about, maybe some fundraising techniques and community building?
So the easiest way to see what this crazy group is about is exactly what David said. Just check out the list of events. If one of them speaks to you, sign up. And you can see that list at joindpp.org. So joindpp.org in one word. Otherwise, I think we both spend too much time on LinkedIn. So that's also a pretty good bet.
It is a good bet. All right. Thank you so much, Louis. Have an amazing rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.